I don't think we've ever just sat together in silence before the intro, have we? Feels different.
Yeah, we always jump in to fix the silence. At least I do.
Yeah. Maybe there's a theme in that
Maybe
about the
there's a
process of
lesson in
recovery.
there. Yeah, the instinct to fix. Well, what are we talking about today? Let's orient.
Let's. So just in case the listener's a bit confused about how we started that episode, Steph and I normally sit here chatting for 26 seconds during the intro, and for some reason today we just fell into silence together. And something about jumping in before you're ready. Is that the lesson we can extrapolate?
That, or to me, it's like the instinct to do instead of to let be, to fix something instead of to let it evolve.
Before we get into this episode, we would just like to issue a trigger warning. In the first 5 to 10 minutes of the podcast, Steph and I are talking about our bulimia recovery. So there is talk of purging. If you want to miss this out, please have a look in the show notes and we will put a timestamp below of when you would be past any talk of purging. We hope you find this episode helpful. So if you're a new listener and this is the first of our episodes you're listening to, what are you doing? This is the fourth one of our Back to Basics series. Go back a few weeks, at least start at number 1. So I'm expecting that there's no one listening to this who's listening to us for the first time, because this is building on something, right? This is why we've done it in the order that we have in the Back to Basics series. This is more about the process of recovery. We talked about why you might have a problem, if you have a problem, and some of the tools and things you can use in recovery. Why is it important then? Why did we think it was important to have a whole episode where we just talk about the process itself? Because now we've got the tools. Let's just, why listen to this 4th episode? Let's just zoom off and start applying those. Right?
Yeah. Because it is unpredictably nuanced, the process, and also it's so different for different people, right? So it's not necessarily here's the tools, use them. It's how do you use them? When do you use them? How much do you use them? Do you use them? Do you use certain ones and not others? Why do some people need to use certain ones and not others? There's so many questions. There's so many variables that come into the process of recovery that it's worth talking about. And I think maybe normalizing and validating some of the ways that recovery looks or can look, and explaining maybe why and how and what to do in the face of different parts of this process. Which again, I mean, even the process itself is the timeline of this process, which is one of the things that we have up to talk about, right? Like, how long does this take? This is a question I get all the time. How long is this going to take? Everyone says, I know you can't tell me how long it takes, but like ballpark.
Well, how would you answer the question for yourself? How long do you feel like it took for you?
Well, I have a unique, it can be unique in that, right? I started on a day. I had this like day one kind of thing. So I could measure how long it took for me to get to a place where I wasn't binging anymore, if that is the criteria, right? And for me, to be honest, my recovery seemed to evolve in 3-month periods where I had these it seemed almost like the first 3 months looked this one way. And then the next 3 months, it was almost like in phases. It looked a different way. The following, by 9 months, however, at that point, I remember thinking, I was like, am I recovered? Like, is this behind me? Because my behaviors were almost non-existent. And by a year, I felt really pretty solid in that. The next year, though, was a lot of solidifying and kind of growing branches in other directions, like thinking about gentle nutrition and these things, which I didn't name that at the time, but there were tendrils of it that grew. But I would say the bulk of my recovery happened within a year. I would say it took about a year.
I sometimes say a little bit tongue in cheek when people ask me how long it took me to recover, that I felt like I was trying to recover from the day it started. Like that felt like what I was doing as well, because I was binging for less than a year before it became, I would say, sporadically bulimia. And then bulimia, probably 5 or 6 years of that. And the recovery from bulimia part, it was a decision to stop the purging, but that decision only came about from a real dawning realization in me that I could see how the purging made the binging worse. I realized that I couldn't hide from that fact. And I remember the moment where it was so certain to me that this was making everything worse. There was no way I was going to stop binging while I was still purging, because I could see how after purging, my eating would be way worse for the next few days, in a way that when I wasn't purging, it was still binging and it was still difficult. I felt that. And I remember making the decision not to. And even after making the decision not to, there was maybe about three times that I did it again after that, spaced out maybe over 18 months.
Oh, wow.
Just an odd moment where it was like, but I remember one time doing it when I hadn't done it for maybe nearly a year, and being, what the heck was that? You know, really kind of disconcerting, but it didn't turn into more. I didn't continue doing it, which was fortunate. So that felt different, but there was no real celebration for me in the recovery of that, because I was still binging, because I was still struggling with this day in, day out, and I was still miserable.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
How did you, because I find it hard to remember for myself, but how did you deal with, because I think the hardest part about stopping purging is stopping purging. Like it's the instinct to do it is as big as the instinct to binge. So how did you, because the decision you talk about is cognitive and higher brain, right? So how did you, in a moment where you were feeling the urge, which is more, it's less there, it's kind of more primal, if you experienced it that way, how did you recruit that decision as compelling enough in that moment?
I think because once I'd got to the point when I was eating where I thought, okay, I'm going to purge, I would then eat probably even more than I would have in a normal binge, if you like. And there was something for me around the act of purging that was about wiping the slate clean and feeling like it was a fresh start. That was the thinking cycle for me. It felt like this fresh start. And the illusion of that was gradually eroded away when I realized it wasn't. It was a disruptor in and of itself. I never went from purging one day to any kind of stability the next couple of days. Never. But I had experiences where I might have had a massive binge one day, not purged, and managed to find a bit of stability for a couple of days afterwards. But I saw it never happened. Interesting. Yeah. And I've always sort of understood that to be like a neurological disruptor, like it just disrupted my appetite, or something in my brain, I think, was disrupted by the act of purging. Didn't think we were necessarily going to go there.
Well, and we don't have, that's a branch, but.
Yeah, but no, I think it's helpful because there will be people listening to this who have certainly experienced or engaging in purging behaviors, but I appreciate it doesn't apply to everybody. So then it was probably another 4 years where I would say that binging still felt like the biggest problem in my life that I was trying to fix. And though the worst, this is why I find the timeline thing so difficult for me, because I don't have that day. So I think for me, it was, I would have moments of relative stability around food, and they just gradually got a bit longer and a bit longer. And I started to realize that actually when I did it this way, when I said to myself things like, okay, I'm not pursuing weight loss, I'm not trying to lose weight today, I am trying to enjoy my food, I need to make sure that I have an idea of what I'm going to eat today. I need to be just a little bit aware, just listening to what's going on inside me a little bit, because if I find myself getting into that, it's like a feeling where, because I haven't been paying attention to what's going on in my mind or my emotions, it comes through as like this agitation and almost like a trapped feeling. And then I can't define it. I couldn't define it. And then I would just want to escape from it or numb out, or I would just suddenly feel very overwhelmed. And it was because I wasn't paying attention to my emotions, and because my sense of shame, I didn't have that really loud voice in my head saying everything that was wrong with me. It was just an emotional experience. I wasn't even able to process this feeling of shame. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
So I think it's the more that I started doing some thought work, looking at how I was thinking, talking in therapy, understanding my belief systems a bit more as well. The Last Supper eating, I've mentioned this before, that was a game changer for me because I really saw how making these plans for the next day or weeks or whatever led me to eating even more now. So then just got easier and easier over time. But I would still say that even when I wasn't binging, I still felt like I had moments where eating felt a bit compulsive. I had moments where eating might feel quite emotional. And of course, even now, I have moments where eating does feel emotional, and even moments where eating can feel compulsive, because we
Mm-hmm.
spoke about this once before. Sometimes we have a compulsion to eat, and if we get too hungry or whatever circumstances, but it doesn't spiral into like
Yeah.
days of binging.
And another episode to reflect on, if this is resonating for you, is the episode where we talk about what does recovery really look like. To me, what you just said, that one of the biggest differences from pre to post recovery is the lack of spiraling. Like when a behavior exists, it exists in and of itself. It doesn't become the impetus for this completely devolving process of now I'm going to keep going and going and going, and I don't really know how to stop. It's episode 94, in case you want to
Yes.
have a peek. A
Yes.
lot of people like that episode. It was just a kind of look into Sarah and I's personal experience of what recovery feels like to us now. I want to talk about my Tetris analogy for this one, because when you said, I feel like recovery you started the day that the eating disorder started, I related to that. And yes, on this one day, I decided to stop restricting. And that really was a huge catalyst for my own recovery. However, that didn't exist in a vacuum. There had been 25 years prior where I had been learning about concepts and reading things like Janine Roth and Catherine Hansen. Again, we've got episodes that reflect their theories and our thoughts about their influence on our own recovery. These are what I call like these Tetris pieces. I've talked about this in another episode, right? I think that we do work even when there's nothing to show for it. So I'm sure that most people here have heard about or worked on to some degree or become aware of their own inclinations towards perfectionism, or, and not everybody, but things like perfectionism, black and white thinking, catastrophic thinking, self-compassion, nervous system regulation, maybe. And conceptually, we might learn about these things. And if you have disordered eating or an eating disorder, I mean, chances are you've applied everything you've ever learned to how could this help me recover? I mean, I used to extrapolate from things that had nothing to do with it. Like, how could I habits, how could I out habit my way out of binge eating? And I think that that does stuff. I think that that puts pieces together in little corners of your mind that even though there's not that piece that brings them all together, it's not doing something. I started on this one day, but throughout that process, at that point, the major piece for me was I'm not restricting anymore. And that was the thing that really brought all the rest of it together and made it make sense. But if I hadn't done all that work all those years, that to me, it felt like I was just running around in circles and not getting anywhere, which to some degree I was. But I was also learning, and I was also kind of evolving and learning about myself and how my brain works. I just couldn't make it apply, but it helped me apply it all in that year, right? Like all of a sudden I was like, "Oh, I get it. I get why self-compassion is a thing. I get my black and white thinking in this moment. I can see it now. And it makes sense for me now, and I can use that conceptually now." So when you are, if you are someone who has been working and working and learning and reading and listening to podcasts and absorbing a lot of information about recovery, and your behavior is just not going anywhere, it doesn't mean you're not doing any work. And I think that that's helpful for the hope aspect, because you're not wasting your time. These things matter. They make sense for a reason. They're resonating within you for a reason. And sometimes there's just an X factor that brings those concepts together in a more coherent way. And waiting for that X factor brings us to the topic of readiness too, I think, where somehow everything starts to make sense.
Yes. Yes, I like that. The point where I could go, okay, I think I can securely feel like I'm recovered, was when I could go through phases where I felt low disconnected. And I had that feeling, that same feeling of not wanting to be with myself at all. And I didn't use food for that. I would be more likely to then lose myself in TV or something, just constant distractions, whether it's podcasts or games on my phone or even people, being around people. And it would be the same process of what I was playing out with food. And there was still a sense of, even after I would say I'd recovered from a food perspective, of feeling a great deal of shame about that, because it still felt like a backsliding into something, even though I wasn't reaching for the food. I was like, why haven't I fixed this part of me that feels like this and just wants to distract and wants to escape? And I can honestly say that it's probably only the last 18 months where I can say at my visceral core, I feel compassion for myself when I go through very brief cycles now. So now I might only feel like that for a couple of days. Previously, that could go on longer. So it would be nice to have this really neat package where it's like, I realized these things about myself, and then I was released from ever having to feel like that. No, it was still going through those same feelings. It just so happened that food didn't become the mechanism to get through it.
That's a great point. I think through recovery, it's only in retrospect that I have realized the food was the symptom of some of these, or the vehicle of coping for some of these feelings that I think I imagined they would go away altogether. They were a package deal. And then, in helping my behaviors change, or when the behaviors changed, it didn't mean that the core changed. However, my capacity to cope has also increased, not made invisible, but yes, these existential things we talk about, right? Like these feelings of despair, or, I play whack-a-mole with it in other areas of my life where now the scarcity is around this, or, the pathologizing is around that, and that still happens. But the coping cover up, so to speak, has changed, alleviated a bit. Yeah. So not to expect that. Again, I also used to think that anxiety and depression were that I had those things because I had an eating disorder. Like my eating disorder was the root of my depression or my anxiety. And as it turns out,
oh man,
not so.
What is the root, Stef? What is the root
of my anxiety? Yeah, if only I knew. No, I think these things exist. I mean, I have my theories. It's a different episode, and yes, your eating disorder behaviors can certainly exacerbate the feelings of anxiety and depression for sure. However, I don't believe them to be the root. At least for me, they were not the root. And so that was kind of a rude awakening too. Still, I wouldn't trade it, but I was kind of like, oh man, that's still here.
I think as well, I want to speak to that moment when, and I went through it so many times, that tumbling into catastrophic thinking throughout the recovery process. That bit where so often I would have these moments where I just thought, why are you even bothering? You're never going to be able to. Other people might be able to, but you can't, and you messed up again, and you were going to do like all of that. And for me, the catastrophization was worse, sort of the higher the high. So to try and explain that a bit more, in recovery, if I felt like I was doing well, I was riding high. There's a pride that came with that. And then when I felt like I was flat on my face again, I'm back in a binging cycle, I would feel like the worst person in the world. And so it was almost like I stopped congratulating myself when I was doing well, because I became to start expecting that there are going to be times when I'm going to end up back here, and that's just going to be the case. Yeah. And it's like that now sometimes with these moments or these feelings that I still sometimes have in myself, much less catastrophic now, because I'm like, this is here again. I guess I'm here. I'm in this cycle. All right.
Yes.
Like, Sarah, yes. Bless you. Let's just get through. It'll pass.
Sweetheart.
We're going to be okay. Yeah, sweetheart. We're fine. We're okay. It's going to be fine.
Yeah, that's like that reminds me of attachment. Like I had such issues with attaching to all sorts of things, my diets, my lifestyles, my weight loss, my body. The attachment to those things was very similar to the attachment to doing well, right? So I'm beating it, and then you find yourself almost attaching to that idea, and then the expectation rises, and you're you should sort of like become invested in that. And the more we're attaching to these things, I think then when we're, not able to, that creates this gap and this almost like this depression, this despair of not having that thing. So yeah, attachment is a theory I love to talk about in this concept. But let's get to readiness. And what does that even mean in reference to like who's not ready? Who would not be ready to recover? When would that even exist? And how do you know if you are? And I had somebody ask me once, how do you get ready? How do you become ready?
First of all, depends on what it is that you think you need to do as a first step of recovery. So let's say that for many people, it's stopping restricting, right? For a lot of people, it's like, I'm not pursuing weight loss in this moment. And I was having this conversation with someone recently, actually, and this was how I put it. And I don't know if it can sound quite depressing. So just see what you think and see if you've got a more positive spin on this stuff. But from what I've seen, and massively influenced by my own bias, is many only seem able to let go of the pursuit of weight loss when one of two things happen. One, they realize that in the pursuit of weight loss, it's pushing it further away. This idea that people gain weight when they try to lose weight. We know that dieting is one of the biggest predictors of weight gain. And they see that for themselves. They recognize it, like they see it, not just someone saying it. And they're like, oh, that sounds true. They realize it. They see their own pattern. And they go, oh, this doesn't work. If I do this, this actually increases the likelihood of weight gain. So that's one way I think people get to a place of readiness, realizing that. And then the other one is that it just hurts too much to keep trying.
Yeah.
Hitting a real pain point is either not working or it's hurting too much. If you're not ready, thinking of it this way, does that mean it's not hurting enough yet? That's the depressive conclusion.
I understand. It's almost like the negative reinforcement instead of the positive. The only time I've heard this, not personal experience though, is when somebody has said to me, I felt like my recovery started when I realized what I'd be passing on to my kids or to my, to my daughter. I didn't want my daughter to deal with it. And that was like this wake up call that set in motion this readiness to recover. But I had 3 girls and that was not enough for me. Yeah. So I never was motivated by a wanting of something as much as I was, to your point, motivated by the desire to get away from something, or that some, the negative reinforcement there of, and interesting. I completely agree with your first point about recognizing that weight loss itself is less likely if we keep restricting. I would have totally, I feel that in my bones, but I also feel like oddly, was that because I was thinner then and I knew I'd gain weight, but I don't know that I had put together yet that I would keep.
Well, that's why I thought it was
number 2
into the second category. Yeah. I think it could be both, but I think on the whole it can be one or the other. It can be independently or together.
I think too there is maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, listeners. I would like to hear from anyone who would speak otherwise, and you too, Sarah. I have noticed just from working with people that age is a factor in terms of when you're 19 and 20. I don't know. I just don't think you've had enough chance to prove it all wrong. Like I felt when I was 19 and 20 that I could figure it out, that I could find the loopholes. Life just hadn't worn me down enough yet. You know what I mean? Like experience hadn't proven. I didn't have enough time. And I think that there's something about when I work with younger people, late teens or very early 20s, it's harder. I feel like sometimes it's just, there's so much work you can do. And I think that part of that has to do with learning for oneself. And that only happens with age and time. Mm-hmm. That's a huge generalization. Nonetheless, I make it. And is time and age different? I don't know. There's something to be said of spending time in the disorder for long enough to feel like it's no longer worth it. And that you've seen enough and experienced enough and been through it enough to see things like you're talking about, to really, from that embodied place, understand what's going on, not just from the cognitive place. Because again, I work with younger people who cognitively get it. It makes sense. They can recite it backwards and forwards. I don't know how much of that feels embodied in them, how much of them feels like true inside because they haven't necessarily seen it yet. They haven't necessarily been through it enough times to feel like it's repeating something over and over and expecting different results.
I have seen a more positive stance before, not many times, a couple of times, where somebody has received the message through this kind of work, this type of thing that you and I do, that you're okay. Like, you don't have to keep trying to lose weight. You are allowed to exist as you are. And occasionally there's someone who that is all that they needed to hear. They've needed to hear that for the longest time and they never heard it. And then they even kind of conceptualizing this idea of, oh, maybe I could just be okay. Maybe I don't have to keep trying to make my body smaller. Again, it's not many. It's only happened a couple of times. I felt that a little bit actually when I read Megan Jane Crabb's book.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, oh, it's possible to just exist in the body I have and never need to try to change it. I found that book really impactful because it really made me properly consider that for myself. Because I was all about, okay, I'm not gonna try and lose weight for at least a while. Let me heal this thing first. But there was always at some point I'll probably go back to it, or maybe just naturally lose weight. All the kind of thinking that goes on in recovery as well. And that book made me go, oh, maybe I actually don't have to. Yeah. And I remember feeling a little bit of release in that idea that I don't have to. Yeah. I thought I had to, and I don't have to.
It's revolutionary.
And this is going to be, I really want to kind of acknowledge size diversity in this as well, because the pressure that you might feel about reducing your body size can come from different places. Like, my body size wasn't affecting my mobility or anything like that. So it could feel different for somebody in a larger body going, oh, that doesn't feel possible, compared to when it's more about what feels socially acceptable.
Yes. That always is going to go without saying. I remember for me, that book that did that for you was Sonia Renee Taylor's The Body is Not an Apology. She has this theory of radical self-love, and just, it doesn't matter what everyone else is saying or what society expects and all this. You just radically accept yourself. And it was just like, what? This is novel. And I think that for younger generations or younger people, that line of thinking, this is new. We never heard this. I never heard this growing up. This was not there. So while there is the barrier, potentially this barrier of age, as far as less experience, there's the benefit, however, of more conversations and more tolerance, at least on the outside, that there are more conversations like this happening, and that those ideas are getting embedded younger instead of, again, when I also working with people more my age and above, it's like, well, these expectations of myself have been wired in for so long. It's much harder to uproot them. Whereas for someone younger, those aren't as solidified yet.
I can't remember what episode we spoke about it on, but we talked once about this idea of recovery becoming your purpose. We can become very invested. A lot of energy goes into recovery. And there could be maybe even a subconscious part of you that to achieve, quote unquote, recovery means to lose your sense of purpose. The act of being in recovery as well can take over, and create purpose and meaning. But then what happens to the purpose and meaning if you become recovered?
It's also like, it's your project. It's what you're doing. It's what you're spending your time doing. And there's a loss if you're not doing that. So I think to some degree, you could get sort of stuck in recovery for this reason, right? Where it's like, well, if I get too close to the edge of like this not mattering as much anymore, that just doesn't, what do I do then? It's very empty. I don't know what kind of subconscious things happen to keep us working on stuff. I think naming that is probably really important, bringing that conscious, if that's something that is going on almost subconsciously, to think, is this part of something I need? Like, do I need this work? Do I need to be working on myself in this way to feel safe? And safety being another key concept for readiness. Do we feel safe enough not to have an eating disorder? Do we feel safe enough not to be in recovery? Because these two things are tied to the same topics. I mean, it's still familiar territory. So what say you?
Well, I think part of recovery, and this is going to sound like an oxymoron, but part of the recovery process is not always focusing on recovery. Because the whole point of recovery is to free yourself from this to make space for other things. And so we need to bring other things into our lives. And I don't mean, when I say things, I just mean areas where you want to be putting your energy, whether it's into friendships or your family or your work, or even just whatever it might be, just how you want to show up in the world, which isn't about how you're eating and your body. The more you're focused on the food and body, even if you're focusing on trying to quote unquote fix it, the more you are taking energy away from areas that need it, because we need to grow those parts.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I'll have people who'll come to me between sessions or between groups and go, I haven't been thinking about it at all this week. And oh, I feel really bad about that. And they feel like they've done something wrong, that they haven't spent a week reflecting on what we spoke
Yeah.
about the week before. Well, let's get curious about that. Were you living your life? Or was there
Yeah.
something going on that, part of you was not wanting to go near? How do we think about that? Because it can
Yeah.
be either or both.
Yes. And, to anyone who this might have occurred to by now, you and I have kept a foot in, right? To some degree, right? Like we haven't let it go conceptually. And I think that when I started this podcast, when I started my Instagram, when I started coaching, maybe there was a part of me that did still need to keep that foot in. I feel now that I don't. I feel like I could talk about anything at this point. As long as we kept the podcast, like I could change topics. I don't worry, we won't do it, but at least not right now. But, I feel like I can safely leave it. I don't feel compelled to, I just feel compelled to connect and talk. Whatever it's about is fair game, I don't know. Like maybe I needed to slowly do that because that felt safest to me. And so it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be like, when I'm recovered, I just have to leave it. No, I mean, you can still dabble in like self-growth related to, you have to feel ready to let it go. And that is a process. And again, for some might be very cut and dry. Just, I'm out of here. I'm so glad to be free of this. I'm moving on. And for others might feel more tentative and slower. And by slower, when I say slow, like I really mean it. I mean years and years. I don't think that you just like, it's so hard to recover sooner than that. And that this is such an embedded thing that took many years to get to where it got to for many. And so it's going to take a long time to really work itself out. And that's a gradual slope.
I also want to just mention, and I know I've spoken about it before briefly, but when I talk about it in terms of states, this for me was crucial, although I wasn't using this kind of language at the time, because recovery often feels like you're getting from A to B, even if there's ups and downs and you go back and forward, there's still that you're starting at this point and you're ending at that point. And the problem with that kind of thinking for me is every time that I was back in the binging and the chaos and the confusion, I felt like I was back at square one and starting all over again. And that was really demoralizing. And it was eroding any sense of self-trust that anything was ever going to be able to change. And I started looking at it more like any time that I was in a place where I felt regulated and I felt pretty balanced and food felt pretty calm, that was recovered. That was the recovered state. That's what I'm trying to create more of. And then when I fell back into the chaos, something went awry in some way. I just ended up binging again. Sometimes I couldn't even tell you why. That the task was figuring out how to get back into regulation. So rather than it being, I'm just gradually removing this behavior from my life, it was much more this in and out. But as I developed the skills and I learned the things that when I do it like this, when I think about it like this, and when I show up for myself like this, everything seems to balance out well enough with food. Because I felt like I could develop those skills, anytime I felt out of whack with food, I knew how to get back again. And that was what really gave me confidence, because I thought, even if I binge again, I know how to find my way back. And that was so much more helpful than this idea of I managed to just stop binging or the urges stop, whatever it was. It's like, it's fine. I know how to get back. And that I share that because,
How? What's your roadmap?
So the roadmap would be things like planning my meals was really important, because I found that when I started making decisions on the fly, that was when things could become a bit dysregulated for me as well. Checking in with my mindset around, because sometimes there was a bit of sneaky restrictive thinking going on. So I would reset my intention around, I am not focusing on trying to lose weight at this time. I would go into this, okay, I'm going to have my meals. I need to plan some meals and I can have whatever I want to eat. The only condition is I need to actually enjoy it and experience it. And that doesn't mean this kind of like mindful eating where you're not allowed to do anything else. I could ask myself, what is the most enjoyable way of having this particular food? And the answer might be, I want to curl up under a blanket and watch my favorite show and have it like that. But I was still experiencing the food. It wasn't a numbing out. Another one that was big for me was making sure I spent some time in my own mind without distraction. Because I found if I was distracting myself all the time, stuff was kind of getting buried and suppressed that I didn't really understand. And then I'd feel a bit agitated, and that could sometimes come out in a binge urge. So it was all these things that I was practicing that I knew as long as I'm willing to do these things, I'm going to be okay. So there wasn't the catastrophization that I had had for so long. Every time I'd started binging again, it was like, okay, I'm binging again. What do I need to do to find my way back?
Yeah.
And then you do that more and more. And then it's just less and less binging as the time went on for me. And I just want to offer that as that was my experience. And I think that for some people, it's a helpful way of thinking about it.
It requires some patience, because I'm thinking about when I would binge, the getting back to my recovery. You have to kind of wait a little bit for all those things to sort of fold back in, and to feel like you're back on solid ground, and I was very much of the mindset of like, if I can't get it right now, then like I that would send me into a panic. So there is something of this patience of, here are my tools, whatever they may be, and have patience with those tools. Like keep moving, which sort of reminds me of like everyone's heard this, right? That the recovery is not linear. And again, that's one of those concepts that you can completely understand intellectually and be like, yeah, of course, that makes sense. But then when you're in it, it's like a panic situation. It feels true until it's true for you. And then it feels just like regression and catastrophic thinking comes up and all of that. But so I don't know how to get around that except to use your state point of view. I think that's a helpful conceptualization of understanding that you haven't fallen backwards. You're not back at square one. You've just flipped a state, and that you can just, by extension, if you got there, you could also get out of there, and that's part of what's going on. The other visual I really like and concept I really like is, have you ever seen that reel or video of, I think it's a dahlia flower. I think it's this big white flower, and basically they film it over over time, and it goes from just being a closed bud to an openly bloomed huge flower. And they fast forward it to play it. And what you see is that the actual progression of the dahlia's bloom is it goes from tight and contracted, and it opens a bit, and then it contracts again. And then it opens a bit bigger, and then it contracts again. And then it opens a bit bigger, and it goes through this whole thing until it's in full bloom. But the way that it gets there is through a series of forward and backward. It's expansion and contraction. And then you think about it, like, expansion and contraction, that's just like that's a principle of nature, like that exists. That's in like black hole theory, right? Like there's so much about nature that suggests that we contract to expand. And that concept, I wish it had then. Still, though, in other ways, is helpful now to remember that contraction is part of growth, right? So these steps backwards, quote unquote, are part of growth. I've been working with a certain client for a year and a half. And I also want to speak to this, by the way, of the road for anorexia recovery, which I do believe. What do you think? I think it takes longer in most cases than it does in the other eating disorders. That's a generalization, but I do see that anorexia is a bit different in the timeline. But this client has gone through so many periods where she's like in this embodied, ready, hopeful, very proactive state of recovery. And I feel it on my end, right? Like she's very engaged with me, and we're it's this whole thing. And then there's times where she's just less connected, right? There's a sense of disconnection. I don't hear from her as much. She's there, but it's more mechanical. And we've talked about this. And I used this concept to reflect back, because she said, why do I have these tools and then I'm just not using them? And I said, I think it's part of this process of you're in and you're blooming, and then you need to retract a little bit. And it's probably a safety measure, or it's probably just part of the integration process, or just needing some space, which I think we should talk too about, like breaks and things, and what we do. We can't be completely immersed all the time and on all the time and growing all the time. We need our whole system needs a little bit of contraction sometimes and retraction. And I think that that's also part of the process. That it doesn't mean you're not doing anything or that you've fallen backwards. It's just part of a whole. Zoom out a little bit and to see that as part of a whole. I think that concept is really helpful.
And the way it spoke to me, actually, just in my personal experience, when you were saying how you need the contraction to grow, how I felt it in my experience was I needed to practice releasing contraction to grow, which of course then I need the contraction in order to practice the release of it. So I feel that. But the thing that would get me into a longer spate of binging would be when the more stressed I was about the fact I was binging. That's that kind of closed contractive state. And it's also this desire to try to control. I'd be trying to get a grip. Whenever I'm trying to get a grip, I can't, because everything is already bound up so tight. And what I actually needed was this, it's like a softening and a letting go and a going, it's okay. You can eat whatever you want. Just plan some meals. Try and get a little bit of routine going. Remind yourself you're allowed everything. Just try to experience it more like it's this. It's a softening, which you can't practice without the contraction. So it still ties in nicely. Yeah.
I like also how you are almost counterintuitively, but it's true, referring to getting meals back on and like almost that planning as the softening, because that planning is the contraction, right? It's the increase of control, but it doesn't always have to be. And I think that contraction and expansion is really felt. Like you can feel those things. It's not necessarily about the behavior. It's about how it feels. And so if you feel like you're tight, I think it's Gretchen Rubin who has written about she calls it tightening. And that sense of tightening, and you can feel when you're tightening, and that's that I need to control, and it's that panic. And for me, it's almost like it's just a felt sense of recognizing that I'm tightening and getting some breath, getting some air in there, and that softening feeling. And what does that need to, I think that's different in every circumstance, what softening is, what it looks like from the behavior point of view, but it's the feeling really.
And with thoughts as well, because thoughts could be so sticky. I could start having thoughts about binging, and for a longest time, even the minute I started thinking about it, there's the contraction. Oh, I'm thinking about it now. It's going to happen, and I'm already in a battle. And it got to the point where this is kind of with time and practice of the softening, when a thought could come and I could just relax into the thought and be like, okay, like this is a thought. It's okay. It doesn't mean anything. You can still make decisions. Maybe you are going to go and have the thing, maybe not, but it's making it from a softer, calmer, more released place, which I appreciate takes time, because it's the practicing. Because like you say, with the dahlia, at the beginning, it's completely bound up. It's only as the process starts that you've got the contract and the release.
The last thing, though, I do want to speak of is the subtle difference between the organic pain of recovery, right? So recovery does include a lot of discomfort and pain, and it's uncomfortable in many ways, versus if it's re-traumatizing. So I work around trauma, and that's my area of focus right now for anyone who hasn't heard me talk about it. So I do want to name that for many people, there's an intersection of trauma and the eating disorder. And so those two ideas are bound up. And sometimes if we're recovering too fast, and by too fast, that doesn't necessarily objectively, I don't know how you could objectively say that, but just too fast for your own nervous system. It could be almost re-traumatizing or traumatizing. And I've seen this play out through weight gain too fast, right? So if someone is gaining weight through recovery, if that happens quickly, that state in itself, if there's a link between a bigger body being not safe, that is so overwhelming to the system that it can actually impede recovery, right? I think there's a sweet spot of being in the recovery process in a way that feels safe. And what's the line? Like, what's the difference between traumatizing recovery and just growing pains and the discomfort of recovery. And I think that's a hard thing. I could never begin to say what the difference is in any kind of list form. I mean, it's going to be unique to everyone. But I think it would be marked by extended periods of recovery where there's extended times of hope, where there's no hope, there's no sense of getting anywhere at all, to the point of it becoming it's almost bringing you further down and further down and further down, where we're spending more time in maybe panic states or fight or flight or freeze states than not, and watching for that. Because I think that for some of us, recovery has to be slow enough. And I think it really is a lot about pacing and support as well, because I think that if we're not supported and we don't feel held through that process, it can't feel safe for some of us. So there are ways to work with that. But I know that maybe, there's people who try to do this alone and do the things that social media said to do and feel worse than ever. And again, that could also look like recovery, because you do sometimes feel worse before you feel better. But it could also be a feeling worse because we're actually traumatizing ourselves by moving too quickly or moving without enough support.
Yeah.
So,
gosh, if only there was a place where someone could get some support and education on this subject.
So helpful.
Yeah.
If anyone knows, please let us know and write in. Or you could, we have a community of listeners of this podcast. And
I was thinking of your course first, because you were talking
Oh.
specifically about trauma and feeling safe in the body, Stef. That was
Yes,
a lead into
so
that. Have they still
I
got time to
understand.
sign up when this comes out?
Barely. It starts this coming Monday, the 29th. However, I will say this is not, this is for education around nervous system. It is not meant as a replacement for therapy, or it's not a replacement for therapy in any way.
Yes.
It's more about the education and understanding how the nervous system is working. So it would be a supplement to, if this feels resonant, this would be a supplement to recovery. But direct help with trauma, I think direct support with trauma is pretty necessary when it comes to trauma responses.
And for some people who maybe just aren't going to be able to access trauma therapy, that your course might provide them with some tools that they can use to feel more safe. Mm-hmm. It's not a replacement for therapy, but there are tools and practical things that people will be able to take away, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's in the show notes.
Okay. Well, and thus concludes our Back to Basics series. We did it. Yeah. I've had some lovely feedback, actually, from people who've really liked this and liked the format of it. So we're glad to hear it.
Now that you're an intermediate, let us know if there's any other series of interest that we could think about putting together.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. Well, so we say goodbye to January in a few days.
Thank goodness.
Practically spring.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone. Well, thanks for joining us on this series, and we will see you on the next episode.
Bye.